William Kern, and this is the World Meets America report coming to you from New York City, where the bombardment of political advertising has mercifully abated. As many of you have noted in emails and messages, the redesign of worldmeets.us, where we translate articles about the United States from newspapers around the planet, so the American people can see what the rest of the world really thinks of our country, is late. And like many construction projects since time began, we have run into a few technical issues, most notably having to do with migrating our old HTML content to a new content management system in such a way that the links to our work that have built up over the past 10 years are preserved. And I might add, this is also the first time in 10 years that we have taken a hiatus of any kind. So there's a good deal of reconsidering and mulling things over going on. However, watching the current political activities without reporting what the rest of the world thinks is not making me happy. And the relaunch of World Meets Us isn't far off, and the target date is now May 15th. I might also add, World Meets Us, along with its broadcast arm, the World Meets America Report, this program, is a 501c3 journalism and educational nonprofit, and that means we depend on you to function. So I politely beseech you to go either to worldmeetsamerica.com or worldmeets.us, click on the donate button, and support our work with a tax-deductible donation. Now, before I bring on the esteemed Dr. Rebecca Gordon, I want to point out that after this program streams on Thursday, April 21st on talknetwork.com, it will be posted as a free podcast on worldmeetsamerica.com, and it will be packaged with links to Dr. Gordon's books and a video gallery of her public appearances discussing her work, including her previous book, Mainstreaming Torture, which is an in-depth analysis of the complicity of our corrupted media in sanitizing what Americans very recently and almost universally referred to as torture, but which now is magically and widely referred to as enhanced interrogation, which is a universe of activities that sidestep or outright ignore many of the treaties and domestic legal instruments we as a nation have hitherto promulgated, passed into law, and honored. So I hope after this program you will understand why I call Dr. Gordon a societal heroine, and that you will see fit to examine her compelling body of work. Now, I am occasionally humbled by the people we interview on this program. There are some in our society who really take a stand against the most powerful forces of the state and corporate media. One of those is Edward Snowden, who I have not yet interviewed. Another would be my good friend, French national Sandrine Agorge, who has selflessly and at great cost to herself battled the death penalty all over the world, and particularly in the United States. Today's guest, Dr. Rebecca Gordon, in my opinion, is just such a person. Her career, and this is my take on her body of work, has been dedicated to reminding the American people, you and me, of the ideals that this country is supposed to be based upon. And like her last book, Mainstreaming Torture, her new work, American Nuremberg, is meant to hold up a mirror to ourselves to remind us that we are not living up to those ideals. And this is a task that many of us, even those of us who consider ourselves idealists, have long ago thrown up our hands over, to the point that the idea of ever holding our own leaders to account for their demonstrable and well-documented wrongdoing seems like a frustrating, if not futile, exercise. So let me properly introduce Dr. Gordon by providing her scholarly bona fides. Dr. and Professor Rebecca Gordon received her BA from Reed College and her master's degree in divinity and PhD in ethics and social theory from the Graduate Theological Union in Berkeley. She teaches at the philosophy department of the University of San Francisco and for the school's Leo T. McCarthy Center for Public Service and Common Good. She is author of the books Letters from Nicaragua, Cruel and Unusual, How Welfare Reform Punishes Poor People, and most recently, Mainstreaming Torture. Dr. Gordon's new book, American Nuremberg, is about the possibility and imperative of prosecuting U.S. officials for crimes committed since the onset of the absurdly named War on Terror. Before we bring on Dr. Gordon, let me posit a question and quote her new book. Should the United States and its officials be held accountable under international law, the same body of law it itself spearheaded in the post World War II era in an effort to avoid another global catastrophe of a similar scale? What is the danger if the United States continues to insist that others obey international law, but it itself is exceptional in this regard? Quoting Dr. Gordon's book, American Nuremberg, if the most powerful country in the world, a country that still, decades after the end of the Soviet Union, calls itself the leader of the free world, can violate international laws of war and human rights with complete impunity, then why should any other nation be so constrained? For the sake of the victims of the war on terror, for the sake of our national soul, but even more for the future of humanity, we need a full accounting and real accountability for American war criminals. We need an American Nuremberg. And with that, I want to welcome Dr. Rebecca Gordon to the World Meets America report. Dr. Gordon, thank you for joining us.
It's a great pleasure to be with you. Thank you for inviting me.
Well, I couldn't be happier to have you on and to be able to, offer some public praise of everything that you're doing. Um, Professor, I just want to ask you, kind of on a I don't know if it's a personal note, but as a way of background here, when you studied for your master's in divinity and your PhD in ethics and social theory, is this the type of work you expected to do? Tell us a little about the path you've traveled to this moment.
So that's actually an interesting question. I went to college way back in the dark ages when there were 3 jobs available for women with a bachelor's. You could be a teacher, you could be a nurse, or you could be a secretary. I refused to learn to type because I was not going to be a secretary. In consequence, I used to get my papers back from my professors with notes on them saying, "This is pretty good, but are you just learning to type?" So I couldn't figure out how to make a living when I got out of college. And my first job was actually putting ice cream cones in boxes in a factory for 8 hours a day. But eventually, a friend took me under her wing and taught me accounting. Consequently, I have ever since been able to find work whenever I need to in the world of debits and credits. So for many years, I lived in San Francisco with my partner in a time when San Francisco was not the most expensive city in the country, when you could live quite cheaply, work part-time doing something like accounting, and spend the rest of your time doing political work. And so during those many years, I worked in the movement for gay and lesbian rights. My partner and I, with 2 other women, edited a newspaper, a quarterly journal that came out for 48 issues for 12 years called Lesbian Contradiction, a journal of irreverent feminism. And then had the opportunity in 1984, 5 years after the Nicaraguan Revolution, to spend 6 months living in the war zones of that country. And this was a time, you may recall, when the United States was against the congressional wishes and against the law. The Reagan administration was funding the group of soldiers who were trying to overthrow the government of the Sandinistas and the Contras. And my job was essentially to visit the places where those attacks had taken place and to record the reality of what the U.S. policy was, what its actual effects were in the lives of the people who were living out in the countryside in that country. And because the Contra had a military strategy of direct and terrifying attacks on civilian population that included not only murders and kidnappings, but also torture, mutilation, leaving the bodies out for people to discover. So I got a chance to see firsthand what war does to, ordinary people who are living in the place where it's happening, and to see the effects of my own country's policies made in Washington, but lived in a place like Nicaragua. I
Mhm.
then got a
Mhm.
chance in 1990, my partner and I, along with a third person, to spend 3 months in South Africa, in Cape Town mostly, at a time, it was a fascinating time. It was in the period after the African National Congress had been officially unbanned. Nelson Mandela had been released from prison, but all of the legal structures of apartheid were still in place. And everyone in the country was talking about what was the transition to democracy actually going to look like. It was an amazing time to be there. We were
Mhm.
doing technical support for a an anti-apartheid newspaper in Cape Town. And I have to say, your introduction about the migration from HTML to another
Mhm.
content management engine, I in my other spare time, I dabble in that sort of thing
Mhm.
and have done
Mhm.
that for war times. So then
Mhm.
we came back to the US. I needed to get a real job, a grown up job, because my mom had become sick and I needed to help pay her for her upkeep. So I became the controller at a foundation for a while. And then in 2000, I had been working with an organization called Californians for Justice that was working to build political power in communities of color in California, especially, but not only in the electoral realm. And I'd been working at a research organization, which is where I wrote Cruel and Usual about welfare reform. But it seemed as though all of the movements that I had been involved in over the years for women's liberation, for GLTB liberation, for
Mhm.
racial justice, all of these seem to have come to a kind of point of stasis. And
Mhm.
there was a real stuck feeling in 2000. And also, my mother's life was coming to its end. And I thought, well, I might as well take advantage of this moment when I don't know what anyone ought to be doing and go back to school. So then I thought,
Mhm.
well, where shall I go? I could study math, I could study history, I could study, I know, I'll study theology because that's everything. And so I went to
Mhm.
Graduate Theological Union, and I only meant to go for a year, a couple of years and get a master's. But it turned out that I fell in love with doing this kind of scholarship.
Mhm.
And so I ended up finishing doing a PhD, and then it became time to think about work. And I knew that at my age, the chances that I was going to get a tenure track job anywhere were pretty limited. So I ended up working and have been for 12 years now at the University of San Francisco, which is a Jesuit institution with a genuine commitment to social justice.
Mhm.
And I have the best job in the world. I get to talk to young people about their deepest values at the moment in their lives when they're trying to figure out what those values are, and to
Mhm.
give them
Mhm.
a few tools to help them think about that. And I teach ethics in combination with service learning, which means they also work in local community based organizations and have a chance to take the theoretical stuff we're doing in the classroom and use it as a way of interpreting their experiences in the field. And their experiences in the field give them a sort of something concrete to think about with all this theory they're absorbing. And when it works
Mhm.
well, it's wonderful.
Well, I mean, that's quite a set of experiences. It reminded me earlier when you were talking about the Contras in Nicaragua that, I had an internship at the United Nations when I was an undergraduate, and it was my job as the American to get all of the other interns from other countries together for a visit to the U.S. Embassy, the U.S. mission, which is across the street,
Right,
obviously,
right.
from the UN. And the ambassador at the time was Vernon Walters.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And during this tete-a-tete, I brought up the issue of the mining in the Nicaraguan
Right.
harbors,
And
and we were immediately ushered out of his office. And that was the last I ever saw of Vernon Walters.
oh my.
Um,
But that's an important point because actually, this is an example that
mhm.
mining of the harbors is an example of the United States refusing to accept the judgment of a court of which it was actually part of the founding. That is the World Court, which is different from the International Court.
Yes, 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 it
Nicaragua
is.
took the United States to court for mining
Mhm.
its harbors, which is, by the way, an act of war.
Mhm.
And the court decided in Nicaragua's favor, and awarded a multi-million-dollar judgment, which the United States, of course, never paid.
That is yeah, that's it really is quite a fascinating story, and that all, I mean, we could all, it all goes into the Iran-Contra affair and
Mm-hmm.
that crazy trip by the National Security Advisor with a big cake
Right.
for the Ayatollah. I mean, there's so much craziness
Oh,
in there and that whole story, and it really is, it does underline a lot of what your book is about, and that's what we're going to talk about. Now, let's get down to
okay.
business. I want to ask you something. How much, in your view, does the failure of the American people since 9/11 to stand up for civil liberties and human rights, many of us thought were boilerplate American values,
Mm-hmm.
how much did that have to do with the overarching influence of the national security state and the intelligence services over the mainstream media and the political process? You want to take a stab at that? What do you think about
Absolutely.
that?
It's a very interesting question. And I think what I would say is even without the NSA, the Bush administration, as soon as September 11th happened, took advantage of those terrible
Mm,
attacks for purposes that they continued to milk throughout, two
mhm,
terms of the Bush Cheney administration. And this is something that I address actually in Mainstreaming Torture. What I say is we have been taught over the last now almost 15 years to believe that each one of us is in mortal danger of attack from a terrorist
mhm,
imminently, and to
mhm,
believe that only the power of the state and our willingness to allow the state both to do whatever kinds of surveillance that it feels it needs to do, or to perform whatever kinds of criminal acts, such as torture or illegal war making, it needs to do, with the understanding that we're permitting those things because we believe that those things will make us perfectly secure. This
mhm,
is a lie,
mhm,
obviously. It's
mhm,
a lie on two grounds. Number one, there is no such thing as perfect security. Every single one of us, I hate to tell you and your audience that this, every one of us is mortal. We are all going to die.
mhm, mhm,
And number two, the activities that the NSA and the public face of these administrations, those have not actually made us more secure. So it's a lie on two
mhm,
grounds.
mhm. Well, would you say that we as a people should be more willing to accept a degree of danger, perhaps even a high degree of danger, for the sake of preserving the freedoms and ideals we've always thought comprise what it is to be an American?
Well, I'll say that in the English language, we have a word for people who are willing to allow anything to happen as long as it will secure our personal survival. We
Hmm.
call people like
Hmm.
that cowards.
Hmm.
And my working title, actually, for Mainstreaming Torture was A Nation of Cowards. But the
Hmm.
publisher thought that was a little over the top. But I think,
Well, we're
yeah,
gonna get into the torture issue quite a bit. I expect.
but,
Let
yeah,
me play devil's
go for
advocate
it.
for a minute. Your book, which outlines how and why a trial along the lines of Nuremberg should be conducted against Bush administration officials, opens up a sizable and complicated can of worms. Why should we as Americans spend the time, money, and energy to prosecute the likes of Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld, and George W. Bush? What would be gained, and how realistic is the idea?
Okay, so those are two separate questions, obviously.
Mm,
What would be
mhm,
gained? As
mhm,
you said in the quotation that you read from the book, I think that one thing that would be regained is some kind of stature for the United States in the community of nations in the world. Under George W. Bush, and to a lesser extent, but still to some extent under President Obama with the drone strikes, the US has become an outcast nation in much of the world. We are not, we are no longer considered, not that I'm saying we ever perhaps should have been, but we are not considered to be emblematic of the values of democracy, freedom, equality, all of those things that the US used to believe it stood for in the world. So that's number one. Number two, and this I think is very important, if, as I imagine you've been following the Republican campaign for the presidency
Mm-hmm.
at all, you'll see that the people who are running to be the Republican candidate are trying to outdo each other in their promises that they will commit more war crimes if elected to the presidency, because nobody has been held accountable for torture, for illegal war making, for kidnapping and rendition, for all the things that have been done in the name of the so-called war on terror, because no
Mm-hmm.
one's been held responsible. People feel completely free to promise that they will do more and better war crimes than have been done in the past. And this, I think, is very dangerous because, this is a country with a short memory. I have to say, we're not
Mm-hmm.
long on historic memory in this country. And so people, it's now, as I said, almost 15 years since September 11th. People have come to accept as a new normal all of these things that the United States now has to do, supposedly, to protect us. If there were prosecutions, we would see in a public way what exactly has been done in our name. And I would hope that at least in some large proportion of the public, there would be a revulsion that would say, not again. How realistic is it? That's a different question.
Well, I mean, we could certainly say that both sides of the political spectrum are outraged over a wide variety of issues.
That is true.
I'm not sure if this is one of them, and I'm going to ask you a little bit about that later
Mm-hmm.
on. But uh, on our allied website, worldmeets.us, we translate articles about the United States from newspapers around the planet. And on this program, we very often speak to columnists from other countries or Americans living abroad. To a person, everyone I have spoken to from outside this country has expressed alarm over the emergence of Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Now, interestingly enough, however, Mr. Trump agrees that American officials at the time of 9/11 made tremendous mistakes of judgment, although he has made no mention of prosecuting
Mm-hmm.
former Bush administration officials. And it would appear that if he did so, it would likely be for not torturing people enough,
Right.
as you pointed out. But just in the context of 9/11 and the war on terrorism, the quote unquote war on terrorism, which, I've always considered an absurdity,
Yes.
I wonder if you would comment on Trump's positions, his comments about the stupidity of attacking Iraq in the first place, his demand that the 28 remaining classified pages
Mm-hmm.
of the 9/11 Commission report that would likely implicate the Saudi royal family in the attacks and a
Mm-hmm.
cover up on the part of U.S. officials be released.
Mm-hmm. So,
What do you have to say about all that?
so it's very interesting. Donald Trump is a peculiar phenomenon because he's not really a Republican, and he is also not an ideologue. He is someone who is tremendously flexible in responding to the cues that he gets from his audiences. So
Hmm.
when he talks about the 28 pages, which I agree absolutely should be released, we do need to understand the real extent of Saudi involvement in September 11th and, continuing involvement in funding jihadism or at least Wahhabi
Hmm.
style Sunni Islam. We need that. It's also, when he says that, he is repeating a right wing meme that I am now discovering because I've been doing quite a bit of interviewing with people on what I would call the far right in this country,
Hmm.
people who are members of militias, for example,
Hmm.
and who
Hmm.
run radio shows. And,
Hmm.
and they all also are very concerned about our relationship with Saudi Arabia. So he picks up on those memes. At the same time, he also recognizes what I think the entire world recognizes and the majority of people in the United States now accept, which is that the invasion of Iraq was a mistake.
Hmm.
Now, whether or not his objection is that it was illegal, I think his objection is more that it did not serve any interests that he considers to be useful interests, for example,
Hmm.
those of real estate magnates living in New York. But so, and I think that he is channeling a strain of right wing isolationism in some ways that is different from, for example, the Ted Cruz approach, which is, carpet bombing and seeing whether sand glows in the dark.
Yes.
So,
Yes, that's right.
so the thing about Trump, and now I'm going to say something that some people may find provocative, but one
Mhm.
of the hallmarks of fascism as a
Mhm.
mass movement of authoritarian, discontented people who are in some ways actually suffering in a genuine way in their lives
Mhm.
is its ideological flexibility. Fascism is much less an ideology than, say, socialism or traditional kinds of Marxism. It is ideologically very flexible, and this is
It's kind of a very local version
yeah,
of, of it.
yeah,
Like wherever it takes place, local conditions play a big role
exactly.
in it. Yeah.
Exactly. And
Hmm.
so I think, I don't honestly take seriously anything that Trump says at face value because I think that it's all performance for the purpose. And I think he's a little shocked himself. I don't think he ever expected that he was going to get this far. And I'm not sure he would actually want to govern. I think he'd probably find it fairly boring. Um, but
And
and
frustrating, I would
frustrating, I
imagine.
imagine, yes, because can't just make it so, or simply fire people who don't make it so. So, but what I think he is articulating is a set of oftentimes contradictory beliefs and desires from a broad range of mostly white men who feel that what they always thought was their birthright to a certain level of economic well-being, a certain level of privilege in a society in which they were very much not in the top rungs, they perceive that that power and privilege is being taken away by the growing numbers, by the demographic changes, by the growing
Hmm.
populations of immigrants, people of color. And this resentment, this anger is something that Donald Trump has been able to stoke, to manipulate, to blow on the embers of until it becomes a full-fledged
Hmm.
conflagration. And for that, I think makes him dangerous. But in terms of what he would actually do in foreign policy, I have no idea. I think he would try to make deals.
Hmm. So he says. I think that what you say is completely true, but I think there's more to it than that. I think it's more than just disaffected white folks. I think that there is a deep conviction on the part of a huge percentage of the American population that the political system, the system of campaign
Mm-hmm.
finance, the economic system, it is, working in the interests of a small
Yes.
handful of special
Yes.
interests, and that we are now living in a plutocracy. I think
Mm-hmm.
it is not a crazy idea. And what Trump would do in office, I agree with you. We have no idea, and that is the roll of the dice of it all.
No, I
Uh,
I think you're exactly right, and that's why I very often hear Trump supporters saying, "Well, if he didn't get the nomination, I would vote for Bernie Sanders," or
hmm.
even the odd Bernie Sanders supporter who would go for Trump,
Right.
because it's that dissatisfaction with what is absolutely a broken democratic system, a system that is completely co-opted by narrow economic interests.
I mean, amazing is it now to see officials of both parties defending elections that have absolutely no connection to how many people voted for a particular
Yep,
person?
yep.
It's an absolutely incredible spectacle. I mean, I cannot help but have enjoyed seeing Donald Trump on stage with his other candidates saying, all of these people are bought and paid for, and I know because I bought and paid for
Mm-hmm.
them before.
Mm-hmm.
It's very hard for me not to really relish and enjoy that
Yeah.
spectacle.
And if
Now,
yeah, go on.
sorry. No, I didn't want to interrupt you.
So the other thing I was going to say, which a lot of people have written, but is really clear too, is that the Republican Party should not be protesting too much that Trump does not represent the positions that they have stood for all these years. It's just that he is not, as they say, dog whistling. He is speaking aloud the things that they have spoken in code in the past.
Hmm. Hmm.
So,
Yeah, the dog whistling going on all the time. Um, Here's something that I have pondered quite a bit. And since we're on this
mhm,
subject, let me just throw this out to you. See what you think about it. I have thought that it doesn't matter who's president. It doesn't matter who gets in there most of the time, because the Oval Office is surrounded by certain special interests connected to the national security state that
mhm,
basically frighten the bejesus out of whoever
mhm,
wins and get them to run around the world putting out whatever fires,
mhm.
or coming up, or fighting whatever wars are on the agenda or whatever, and pretty much not getting done any of the things that they were supposed to get done in the first place that they promised to do.
Mhm.
Um, is it possible that despite Trump's alarming comments, apparently designed to energize the Republican base for electoral purposes, he might be one of the few people capable of resisting the influence of the national security state and the other special interests that surround the Oval Office? I mean, would you agree with those who argue that despite his tremendous shortcomings, he may be just the arsonist we need to burn down the political duopoly that is
Hmm.
providing the basis for this plutocracy or oligarchy we're currently living in?
I
I mean, I agree. It could go either way. Who the hell knows?
I remember, I'm old enough that I remember when I had friends in 1968 who were
Mm,
going to vote for Richard Nixon, or 1972, who were going to vote for Richard Nixon because they thought that would bring on the revolution sooner, that
mm,
that would, sharpen the
mm,
contradictions. And I think that you have a real point about the power of the national security state. And I think when, for example, when President Obama came into office, when he said famously, we're going to stop torture now. I'm issuing my executive order. We're going to
mhm,
close the CIA dark sites. And I assume that they did, but we don't really know. Uh,
mhm,
but the quid pro quo was what he next said, which is we need to look forward and not backwards. And I
mhm,
think that truly he discovered very quickly that there were limits even to presidential power, especially the presidential power of a black man, and that he was, in fact, in a position where he had to make deals and accommodations with the national security state. Now, what I will
mhm,
say about that state, though, that gives me some hope is it is not the monolith that we sometimes think it is. There, the people that are involved in it, although they are sort of a permanent government. And Max Weber, the famous sociologist, wrote about how in in parliamentary systems, the bureaucracies can stay through successive
mhm,
rotating governments. And I
mhm,
agree with you that our national security state definitely fills that niche. It stays regardless of who rotates in and out of the White House. But what I will say is they don't like each other. They fight among themselves all the time. So there's tremendous conflict between, say, the FBI and the CIA over
mhm,
specifically interrogation methods. There is tremendous tension between the CIA and the Defense Intelligence Agency. Within the CIA, there are really two separate cultures. One is the culture of intelligence, which is the old
mhm,
inheritance from the OSS, the Office of Strategic Services during World War II, the Princeton, Yale, East Coast elite who believed that their job was to gather intelligence primarily through the use of the understanding of various written documents, not even on the ground, and the people in operations who are the ones who do the wet work, who get their
mhm,
hands dirty. And the divide, even within the agency, is really strong. There, it's a class divide. And I
mhm,
have friends who grew up, whose parents were in the CIA, who grew up in the CIA, who did friends who had parents who were on each side of that divide. And it's
mhm,
very interesting to hear them talk about how very clear that was from within. So the one thing I would say
mhm,
is there are a few places where we can plant some wedges. To get back to your question about Trump,
Hmm.
I am not convinced, and I'll have two words for you: Supreme Court,
Hmm.
that make me think that anything else being the same, there's no point. There's no point in saying, well, let's bring him in to be the guy who's going to burn it all down. For one thing, you forget that he, of course, is a Plutarch himself.
Hmm. Hmm.
So what?
Well, it's ironic, but that is precisely why it could be, he could actually understand this and could actually go further into dismantling it than other people.
Only if it was going to make him money.
Or whatever people get through the day with money, fame, or
Right.
love, or whatever
Whatever
it
it
is
is.
people want. I mean, well, let's compare Trump and Hillary Clinton because those are the two that are likely going to
Right.
be running. Uh, what hope do you think she has, or what hope do you have that she would be able to stand up for civil rights, civil liberties, privacy, the Bill of Rights? I mean, like you were saying before about the intelligence services and the elements of the national security state often arguing. I don't see them arguing about protecting the Bill of Rights or
No.
protecting the Fourth Amendment or any of the amendments that we hold dear. I see them fighting over turf,
Right.
budgets,
Exactly.
jurisdiction,
Yep.
and things like that, which I think you can expect. And I see, basically members of what we would call the deep state
Hmm.
who walk around regularly beyond the reach of the law. They can lie to Congress. They
Yep.
can lie to the American people on television. They can violate their oaths of
Hmm.
office and get away with it.
Hmm.
Not prosecuted, not forced to resign, nothing.
Nothing.
I'm talking about Clapper at the moment, but there are
There
others.
are
But
lots, yes, and you're exactly right about that. And I think back to the last time that Congress really took on that deep state was probably when Frank Church held his
mm-hmm,
hearings in 1975 into the activities of the CIA,
mm-hmm,
specifically what they were doing inside the United States to
mm-hmm.
US citizens. And that's been a long time ago now. What do I think
Yeah.
about Hillary Clinton in that respect? I think she's a very complicated, very ambitious person who, in her foreign policy, will be essentially no different than your standard Republican president. And when I say that, all I'm saying is that ever since the end of World War II, there has generally, for the most part, been a unified foreign policy between the two parties. Where the
Mm-hmm,
two parties tend to differ is in domestic policy, but they have, for the most part, with minor variations, differences of degree maybe, have essentially been on the same page as far as US foreign policy goes. Hillary
mm-hmm,
Clinton, for example, when she was still Secretary of State, gave the approval to the coup in Honduras. And, I have one of my dearest friends is Honduran, and she says that things are now as bad now in Honduras as they were when the military was running the country in the 1980s and the Contra were hiding out in southern Honduras. And, I don't know if you know, but a woman named Berta Cáceres, who was an indigenous environmental activist in Honduras, was
mm-hmm,
murdered
mm-hmm,
recently. And it seems, other people have been murdered since. They are facing the combination of the narco terrorism and the government's repression. And it was set in motion by that coup in 2009, which Hillary Clinton, after first saying, oh, wait a minute, turned around in 2 days and said, okay, yeah, we give our approval. So,
Well, I mean, but this is exactly why the fact that Hillary Clinton is another status quo candidate in the mold of, candidates we've had for many, many years, people might be willing to throw the dice because they do not think she is going to get in there and break things, which a huge percentage of the American population is demanding right now.
yeah,
And I understand. I mean, I find a lot of the things Donald Trump has said to be offensive, absurd, and they undermine I say American interests. They undermine the interests of,
actual people.
eh, getting along, understanding each other, and figuring out a solution to the mess we're in. So I don't by any means support those things, but I do doubt whether he believes any of those
Yeah.
things. I think he's just saying things to throw red meat to the Republican base because he wants to get nominated. So, we'll see what happens after
Yeah.
that. But in any event, so let me ask you a question that might be a little
Go
fringy
for it.
to listeners of the mainstream media, because I like to think of this program as a bridge between the mainstream and alternative medias. Your book deals with the possibility of bringing Bush era officials to justice for actions taken after 9/11.
Hmm.
But what about before? I mean, like it or not, a very large percentage of the American people doubt the official explanation of what happened on that day. And indeed, many believe the Bush administration was behind the attacks, or that the national security state writ large was behind the attacks as part of a continuing effort to convince a frightened population to maintain catastrophically high military budgets. So, do any of these views seem possible to you?
Here's what I'll say about that. I tend to not believe in the view that they were actually behind it. What I will say is they were certainly within hours willing to take full advantage of all of the opportunities that those attacks represented. But I will say there's one thing that went on before September 11th that is is really important for us to recognize, and that was back in March of 2001, Dick Cheney was holding his series of meetings supposedly to create an energy strategy for the United States. And before
Hmm.
the attacks of 9 11, one of the actual issues that was out there was this question of why would Dick Cheney not say who the people were that he was meeting with to formulate this energy policy? Well, it turned out when eventually some of it came out that those people were in fact the heads of the biggest oil companies and oil service companies like Halliburton, from which he
Hmm.
had, of which he had recently been the CEO, to talk about energy policy from the point of view of how can we get our hands on the oil fields in Iraq. And this material has come out since. So it's very clear that Cheney, Paul Wolfowitz, his people came into office long before September 11th with a plan to create some reason for a military incursion into Iraq and to make it possible for U.S. oil companies to take advantage of the money that was to be made there. And that I think there's no question about. The record is really clear about that. And so one of the reasons why we begin to see torture so soon after the attacks of September 11th is that Donald Rumsfeld at Guantanamo and Dick Cheney and the CIA were looking to get people to say that there was a connection between 9/11 and Saddam Hussein. That
Hmm.
connection did not exist, but it's the main reason that Abu Zubaydah was waterboarded 83 times to get him to say that such a connection existed in order to create a justification in the minds of people in this country for this attack on Iraq.
Hmm.
And that
Well,
is a crime.
we could also add that, the goal of Dick Cheney's life was to unravel the church
Right.
commission reforms
Absolutely.
that, sought to constrain the executive after Nixon. And anyway,
Exactly. Yeah.
that's it.
And he achieved
Uh,
it to a good extent.
yes, he did. And as you said before, they used the 9/11 attacks as an opportunity. And that kind of brought to mind something that Dr. Hall Gardner of the American University in Paris told me a couple of months ago. I asked him, again, I always like to ask a couple of questions that people in the alternative media
Hmm.
would like me to
Hmm.
ask people
Hmm.
who are, somewhat mainstream and respected people. And I asked him if he thought there was, there are a lot of people in the alternative media that believe that all of the shooting events and terrorist attacks, or
Hmm.
at least a lot of them, are false flag incidents, state 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 designed, state arranged false flag incidents for obtaining certain policy objectives. Like
Hmm.
larger military budgets, or keeping people frightened, or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And I asked him, does he think there's any possibility of that? And he said no, he doesn't buy into that, but he does believe that very often the intelligence services know that an attack is about to take place,
And
and
allow it
they
to go
allow it
forward.
to take place so that they can justify all of their positions and budgets,
Mm-hmm.
et cetera, et
Mm-hmm.
cetera, et cetera, which, to be honest with you, I find far more alarming than the theory that all of these events are staged,
Mm-hmm.
and which would mean nobody is actually killed and
Mm-hmm.
it's all
Yeah.
basically a boondoggle. I mean, what do you think about that?
You know, I learned this wonderful expression from the people that I worked with briefly in El Salvador when they were talking about why it was that ordinary folks who had lost their identity papers during the war and were now trying to get registered to vote in 1993, and why every time they would come into town, which took them like 3 hours to walk from wherever they lived in the country, still their ID papers that they had put in weeks before were not there, that the central government was just so slow. And the expression
Mm-hmm.
was strategic incompetence.
Mm-hmm.
And and I think,
Uh,
you know, I think it would not be shocking to suppose that there's some strategic incompetence going on here. I don't find that beyond the realm of belief. What I think is what's really important is that we we have to accept whether or not it's being allowed to happen, it is going to happen. As long as you can buy a semi automatic weapon on the internet or you can put together what you need to build a bomb, there are always going to be disaffected young men, and that's sadly who it usually is, who will, for whatever reason, for whatever ideology they choose to attach it to, be
mm-hmm.
willing to, on occasion, do terrible things. And what
Mm-hmm.
we need to do is develop a willingness to acknowledge that it is impossible to prevent all of them and to say, and still, we want to live in a society in which we have civil liberties, in which we are not under constant surveillance, in which we are not living in constant fear. And what
Mm-hmm.
the administration did, certainly for the 8 years under George W. Bush, was everything they possibly could to gin up our fear. Some of the people I've seen
Exactly.
call it security theater. You know, you go to the airport, you take off your shoes, you take off your belt, you
Mm-hmm.
put your liquids in exactly a quart-size baggie, no bigger, no smaller. You take your computer out, you do all of this stuff, right? And all it does is remind you how much danger you're in and that only the government can protect you. And they can only protect you if you let them do whatever they need to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And the funniest example I ever saw of this was in about 2003 when I was taking a ferry from Cape Cod to Martha's Vineyard Island. And so this is a ferry that runs like 4 or 5 times a day, and it has cars on it and human beings on it and their dogs and their kids, and you're all out there in the beautiful sun. So we're on this ferry, and I looked on either side of the boat, and there were these 50-foot Zodiac Coast Guard boats on either side as an escort, and each one had a 50 caliber machine gun mounted on the bow of the boat. And
Mm-hmm.
I've been making this trip my entire life, and I'd never seen this. So we start to go out into the deep water, out of the harbor, and I just burst out laughing because, first of all, if anybody was going to do anything to that boat, having a machine gun wasn't going to be the solution because it would probably be something planted on the boat, number one.
Right.
And number two, give me a break, right? We're not a target. So I burst out laughing, and this older white guy in suit and tie looks over at me and says, "Well, I don't know about you, but it makes me feel more secure." And I thought, this is what we've come to. The really funny part was we got out into deep water where presumably the attack would have taken place. And once we were there, the two boats turned around and went back to the harbor.
Mm-hmm.
Theater.
Well, I mean, that's the thing. The alarmism that is promoted by the mainstream media on both sides, right and left, Fox News, MSNBC, CNN, you name it, they have their own take on why the national security state should grow ad infinitum.
Yep.
Um, the insidious part of all this seems to me to be that the companies that own these media organizations, they have no interest in informing the public. Their bottom line, their profit motive has nothing to do with informing the American people, and they should not own media organizations, which are supposed to be dedicated to exactly that. And, I can't help it. I see that.
Mm-hmm.
I see that, the political system, our lawmakers are heavily influenced by money
Yep.
coming from a small number of major
And a
industries,
smaller and smaller number. I mean, that's a consolidation that's
right?
been.
And many of them in the national security
Yep.
state. And it is very, very hard for me not to sound in a way. A few years ago, I would have thought I myself was off the deep end. But it seems inescapable to me that we are in this kind of a situation. I never expected this interview to go this way. I was going to ask you things in another order, and we're going to get into a few questions about the book in a second, but just to kind of cap this off here, over the past 10 years, WorldMeets.us has translated a slew of articles from newspapers on almost every continent
Mm-hmm.
that contend that the United States has a plan to redraw the map of the Middle East to suit its own interests,
Mm-hmm.
and that terrorism is one of Washington's tools for doing so. And many of these columnists cite a 2006 article for the Armed Forces Journal written by one of America's most decorated soldiers, who is now a regular guest on Fox News, Colonel Ralph Peters. And in this column, he called for a complete overhaul of the Middle East,
Mm-hmm.
complete with before and after
Yep.
maps.
Yep.
And these international columnists from Latin America, the Middle East,
Mm-hmm.
North Africa, Russia, Persia, and elsewhere often contend that the obvious chaos in the region shows that everything is going according to plan. And many cite a declassified 2012 DIA
Mm-hmm.
document that describes the desirability to America's Arab allies and hence to Washington of the creation of an Islamic caliphate in eastern Syria.
Mm-hmm.
So, what do you think of these claims, and should these assertions form part of any eventual prosecution of U.S. officials? What do you think?
Well, so one of the things I do touch on in the book actually is that people like Paul Wolfowitz and Dick Cheney, Donald Rumsfeld were all members of something in the 1990s called the Project for a New American
Hmm.
Century.
Hmm.
And they were shopping around a document which is freely available now because it wasn't a government document, so it was never classified, but a document which they actually brought to the Clinton administration, and to their credit, the administration said thanks but no thanks, which did exactly that, said, we need to revisit Sykes-Picot, we need to redraw the map of the Middle East. It began with toppling Saddam Hussein. It went on to destabilizing Syria and so forth in exactly, or at least a very similar vein to the document you're talking about. This document's first incarnation actually was in 1992 when it was called A Clean Break, and it was presented to Benjamin Netanyahu when he was first prime minister of Israel as an opportunity for Israel to adopt exactly this same approach. Now, he also said no thank you, I think partly because the title of the document also referred to a clean break for Israel from US funding, which he was not terribly interested in.
Hmm.
But so I don't think, I'm not familiar with the DIA document, but what I will say is that it there is no question that the biggest crime, and the crime that I really sort of say is central to all the others in American Nuremberg, is the crime of that war on Iraq, partly because of the untold human misery that it created. The numbers are very hard to figure out. It's somewhere between 250,000 and a million Iraqis have died, depending on how you count it, as a result of the war. We're now
Hmm.
looking at the biggest refugee crisis the world has seen since the end of World War II, largely
Hmm.
as a result of the war in Syria, where over half of that entire country have had to leave their homes, and 5 million have had to leave the country. I have friends in Lebanon. There's a quarter of their country, which is not very big, is now Syrian refugees. Jordan, which was already 65% Palestinian refugees, has now been overflowing with Syrian refugees. There is chaos in that part of the world, and if that was the goal, it's certainly been achieved. And to the extent that the US violated the UN Charter, which it did, and declared an illegal war, in Iraq. That, that was the central crime actually at Nuremberg. It was something that the United States and Britain actually argued with Russia or with the Soviet Union and France about. They wanted to make the crime against peace the very first of the crimes that the people at Nuremberg were tried for. And there were people who said, well, that's an ex post facto law because there was no crime against peace. So how can you try people for something that wasn't a crime when they did it? But they pointed out that Germany had signed a treaty that's not very famous, but it's called the Kellogg-Briand Pact. And it essentially in 1928 said, we will not attack another state. And yet they did,
And that is still enforced, by the way. I went and checked.
Absolutely. And the United States is also a signatory. And a lot of people don't know, but in the 6th article of our own Constitution, it's very clearly stated that when we sign and ratify a treaty, that treaty becomes part of the supreme law of the land. When we violate the treaties we've signed, we're not only violating international agreements, we're violating U.S. law. And and then we've also signed the UN Charter. And in the UN Charter, it's very clear in Article 51, if you want to quote chapter and verse, that the conditions under which one nation is allowed to use arms against another nation are extremely limited, and they have to do only with self-defense. And then there's this huge body of international customs of law, customs of war as well as law of war, that says that you can only make a preemptive attack on another nation if an attack from that nation is imminent and confirmed, and there is absolutely no other way of avoiding the attack. None of those things were obtained when the United States went into Iraq. And Kofi Annan, who was Secretary General of the UN, said a year later that in his view, it was an illegal war. The U.S. had promised the Security Council and so, by the way, did Tony Blair or Tony Blair's government of England, when they got the first agreement, the first resolution from the Security Council saying that there would be sanctions if Iraq didn't cooperate with the IAEA and didn't cooperate on the attempts to, secure his weapons of mass destruction, that there would be consequences. And at the time, Britain and the U.S. made identical, like word for word, identical speeches in the Security Council saying, we understand that this is not a mandate for war, and that if there were to be military action, we will return to the Security Council for another resolution. When it came time to do that, and this is in George W. Bush's own memoirs, so this is not, this is not strange history. When it came time to do that, it was clear that both Russia and France, who are permanent members of the Security Council, would have vetoed a resolution. And so George W. Bush met with the ambassadors of Spain and Portugal, two mighty military forces stage, and they all agreed that it was time to attack.
Yeah, that's when we had the whole Freedom Fries thing, and and the Prime Minister of France, his name is escaping me right now. He made the case for not going to war.
Yes.
No, it was his foreign minister. It's a little hard to remember, but he was acting for France at the Security Council on that particular day, and he gave a speech that I do kind of recall. Now we're going to take a break for a moment. When we come back, I'm going to ask Dr. Gordon a couple of questions about whether President Carter and his national security advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski ought to be part of the group of people prosecuted, and a number of other interesting questions. This is William Kern of The World Meets America. We'll be right back. back with Dr. Rebecca Gordon, author of the new book, American Nuremberg. Now, Dr. Gordon, there was something that really caught my attention in your book, and I wanted to bring it up with you and let you comment on it. You recount that it wasn't the United States or Great Britain that wanted to put Nazi war criminals on trial. FDR and Winston Churchill wanted to immediately put captured Nazis to death en masse. And it was Stalin who wanted to hold a public trial in order to give the execution of Nazis most responsible for the horrors of the Hitler regime a sense of legitimacy in the eyes of the world. Can you explain how it was that the heralded guardians of humanity and justice sought summary execution, and the man regarded as a mass murderer second only to Hitler wanted trials?
Well, Joseph Stalin was sort of a master of the show trial.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so I think,
But he had to have known it wasn't going to be conducted solely on the basis of his instructions,
no,
right?
no, and I'm not sure he knew what it would look like at all. But I think he did understand that it would require some kind of legitimacy in the eyes of the world. And what's interesting is that the Roosevelt administration itself was actually divided. And so, you know, it's true that Churchill and Roosevelt at first were not so eager to have trials. And I think part of the problem was that there really was no precedent. There was no precedent in the world for a group of nations coming together
Mm-hmm.
and putting on trial the highest officials of a defeated nation. And it
Mm-hmm.
was so the first real challenge that they faced was how they could devise a a means of doing this, a procedure that would look legitimate in the eyes of the world, that would not look just like Victor's justice.
Mm-hmm.
And
Oh, it makes perfect sense. The question is
why
why
Stalin?
Stalin and not one of the other people?
I think he was a master propagandist, honestly. I'm not
Yeah.
sure he really expected that these would be real trials. And, there was a sense in which these were very imperfect trials. The rules of evidence were not the rules of evidence that we expect
Mm-hmm.
in a US trial today. And one of the biggest ones is this question of discovery, right?
Right.
In US
Right.
trials, both sides know beforehand what the other side is going to put forward.
Right.
But it was very common in these trials that the prosecutors would present a document to one of the accused who was in the witness stand that the accused had not seen before.
Except, as I understand it from your book, a lot of times these documents pertain to activities of these
Oh,
particular individuals. So they did know. I mean, in the past, they took part in it, so they knew,
right.
but they didn't know it was going to come up at
Exactly.
trial.
Exactly.
That was the
That
part
was
of
the
it.
point.
So
Yeah.
they allowed for that.
Right.
I got
Right.
that. Yes.
But
Yes.
and sometimes it didn't go very well. There were people who actually got run around by Goebbels, for example, was really good on the witness
Mm-hmm.
stand. And
Mm-hmm.
so there was a sense that, or Goering rather, not Goebbels, Goering. And there was a sense, and this is another reason why people were concerned actually about having these trials, was that they didn't, and this is true for Roosevelt and Churchill, I think, they didn't want to give them a platform
Mm-hmm.
from
Mm-hmm.
which to attempt to vindicate themselves or to make more propaganda about what they had done. So there was a real concern that, and this did occasionally happen, that if they were allowed this platform, that it would end up boomeranging on the people who were bringing them to trial. In
Mm-hmm.
I think that most of the people who observed Nuremberg were convinced that justice was done, that nobody was convicted who was not guilty. And there were
Mm-hmm.
actually, of the first few people who were put on trial, three of them were acquitted. So there were actual acquittals, which is perhaps
Mm-hmm.
surprising.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I think, it was interesting. The other big issue that existed between France and the Soviet Union on one side and the US and the Brits on the other is that France and the Soviet Union operate under the Napoleonic Code
Right.
and the
Right.
US under the British common law system. So in England and the US, in theory, one is innocent until proven guilty.
Hmm.
Under the Napoleonic Code, it's the other way around.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so that's another reason why I think Stalin was perfectly willing to have trials, because he went into those with the assumption that guilty verdicts were guaranteed.
Well, I'm certainly glad, Uncle Joe brought up the
Yeah,
idea.
really. Yes,
But,
because it,
I agree with you. I mean, he had a lot more time in office and with power
yeah,
than anyone else at that
absolutely.
point. I mean, I guess he had been in office for a couple of
Right,
decades at that
right.
point, right?
And
And he'd seen untold,
horrors.
things happen. So, yeah.
And he had
Uh,
also lost, something like 20 million, me-
yes.
citizens of his country in the
Yeah.
war. I
Yeah.
I think we
But that makes it even more
I
amazing
know.
that he didn't want these people summarily executed. It really amazes me that that little paragraph in your book
Hmm.
actually kind of blew my
Yeah,
mind for a few
yeah.
minutes. I was kind of like, did I read that right, or what am I getting
But
wrong
it's
here?
actually true. Yes.
Now, let me ask you this, as I was mentioning before the break.
Hmm.
Given the fact that President Carter and his national security advisor, Zbigniew Brzezinski, were the first to consider it a bright idea to fund the Islamic fundamentalists of what would become Al Qaeda, and the Reagan administration thought arming these people, who went on to commit untold indiscriminate acts of violence against innocent civilians, was such a terrific notion. Shouldn't they too be in the dock in some capacity? I mean, why draw a line under the Bush administration? Is what I'm saying.
Okay. I think a couple of reasons. Number one, I think that the country has seen some kind of fundamental break since September 11th. That after September 11th, things that had been done in secret and talked about in secret, like torture, for example, suddenly became part of our ordinary public discourse in a way they hadn't been before. Questions that we really thought were settled were brought up again, like torture, like assassinations, that we thought were settled moral and political questions,
Hmm.
are suddenly thrown up for grabs again. And there is, I think, there's a real discontinuity before and after September 11th.
Hmm.
At the same time, Carter and Brzezinski made mistakes in who they chose to fund. I'm not sure that what they did was actually in the realm of a war crime. It was perhaps strategically stupid. And if we want to go back further, I'd say, well, what about Henry Kissinger?
Hmm.
What about
Hmm.
the coup in Chile? What about the what they did in Indonesia? What about
Hmm.
Vietnam? If you want to talk about
Well, I mean, I was thinking in the context of terrorism and,
right
and
and
9/11 and all that.
unintended
I completely agree with you about these other points having to do with Kissinger and Cambodia
Yep.
and whatever else you can throw in there. Um, there's been a long debate about whether 9/11 should have been more properly treated as a police and criminal action rather than a war.
Mm-hmm.
In other words, many people believe that the people responsible for the attack should have been tracked down and brought to justice in the courts, which is an approach I would have thought the proper response of a free republic. You discussed the militarization of the Bush administration response in some detail. How is it, if you can explain it, that the Bush administration made the absurd decision to call this a war, i.e., a war on terror, yet it also decided that combatants captured in that war would not be treated as if they were prisoners of war under the Geneva and other relevant conventions?
Well,
How did they get to that?
George Orwell had a word for this. He called it doublethink. And
Hmm.
it is the ability to completely happily hold two contradictory ideas in your mind at the same time and believe them both. Now, I don't believe that Dick Cheney believed anything, but I think George W. Well, I have no idea. I have no access to the psychology of George W. Bush. But you're absolutely right. This is a central contradiction. The idea of declaring a war on a military tactic, terrorism, is absurd. On the face of it, it makes no sense. The idea that, as Donald Rumsfeld said within a few weeks, this is a war against an enemy that is in at least 60 countries. It's a
Right.
war of decades, it's a war of generations. Yeah, they took advantage of what, as you rightly say, should have been treated as a crime, as a police matter, and used it as an opportunity to put the United States on a so-called war footing, to the extent that even today we see echoes of this in all the candidates who are running for president. Constantly people are saying and focusing on the role of the president as the commander of chief in chief of the armed forces in time of war, which is, yes, one of the duties of the president in the Constitution, but it's been elevated to essentially the central duty of the president. And this goes towards, as you said before, strengthening the power of the executive, and doing that in large part by militarizing the role of the president. And I think it's outrageous. And at the same time, because the war on terror really isn't a war, a lot of the things that they did are terrible crimes, but they're not, strictly speaking, war crimes.
But they chose to
They
call it
chose
a
to call
war.
it, but that doesn't
And
make them.
that has ramifications,
Yes,
legal ramifications. And that is the part that is so mind-boggling
yes,
to me.
that they, well, the way they got around it is they said, well, yes, it's a war, but all of these people that we have captured are not legitimate combatants, right? They call
Well, I mean, they said things like they don't have uniforms or
right,
they don't look the
exactly.
same. Meanwhile, I mean, for example, in Afghanistan, you had people that were defeated
Mm,
that were part of a government.
exactly
So
right.
you could say they were, defending that government.
Absolutely
Yet
right.
these people were somehow decided, it was decided that these people had no rights under the Geneva Conventions.
Absolutely.
I
Yeah.
mean, it makes absolutely no
And
sense.
especially in Afghanistan and in Iraq, those people, especially the Taliban fighters, because as you say, that was the government.
And Saddam's disaffected
Yes,
troops who decided to go rebel
right.
and whatever,
They were the legitimate government of, or if not legitimate, at least the existing government of a country, that a sovereign nation. Yeah, they had a right to defend their nation against attack. And so, yes, the people who were captured should absolutely have been given their Geneva rights. There's no question about that. And, I go into great detail in the book about the extent to which they were and weren't. And one of the ways that people, of course, weren't given their Geneva rights is that they were not allowed to be seen by the International Committee of the Red Cross, and they
hmm
became what are called ghost prisoners, prisoners
hmm
without numbers, right? Prisoners who
hmm
didn't exist. And if you don't exist, well, they can do anything they want to you.
hmm
And
Or we could add the Red Crescent or the Red Cross, right?
right,
I think
the
they're
Red
they're
Cross
both
and the Red Cross
interchangeable.
Society.
In their case, it would have been the Red
Right,
Crescent, probably.
right.
Now, okay. So in the beginning of your book, you examine how legal responsibility for actions taken in the so-called war on terror should be enforced
Mm,
by listing three broad categories of wrongdoing that also served as the basis for the Nuremberg
right.
trials: the crimes against peace, war crimes, and human rights crimes. Let me ask you, in terms of wrongdoing, is it reasonable to compare Dick Cheney's wrongdoing to that of a mass murderer like Hermann Goring? I know you touched upon this for a few minutes, but I just want to, give you a chance to put it
Yeah,
into a little context and
yeah.
explain,
That
why we're having this comparison.
that's a
Yeah.
really fair question. And to be perfectly honest, I didn't choose the title for this book. The
Mm-hmm.
editor of the series came to me and said, I have this book that I want written and I want you to write it, and the title is American Nuremberg. And at first I was really taken aback because, I grew up in the years following World War II. My father was raised in an Orthodox Jewish family. He was in the army during World War II. He was also in the OSS. And in fact, um, literally the day before he died, I asked him one more time what he had done, and he still said he wouldn't tell me. But,
Mm-hmm.
I was brought up, as my generation of this country was, with parents who lived through that war. And I am aware that nothing that the United States has done in the post 9/11 period can possibly compare to the
Right.
scale of what the Nazis did in World War II. There's just no comparison.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
so that's not the comparison I'm making. But what I am saying is the precedent that was established by the idea that the highest officials of a government of a nation could be held to account by the world, by the international community for crimes they committed, that I think is a really important precedent, and it's one that we need to preserve and to strengthen.
And it seems less and less
Yeah,
likely. I mean, that's the thing, and it's just so incredible. I have got to, we have got to hold to some degree the American people responsible for the situation. I mean, don't we?
well, that's,
Because
yeah,
and people, and basically, I mean, what happened after 9/11? We were told to go shopping. We
exactly.
went shopping. No blood was spilled.
Right.
People sacrificed nothing. And it was a very strange thing. And it just seems to me that we used to have people used to refer to it as a civic religion
Mm-hmm.
in this country,
Mm-hmm.
where people they understood the role that citizens
Mm-hmm.
have
Mm-hmm.
in a free society.
Mm-hmm.
Where is that now?
That
It's just not around. It's just not
that is
happening.
such an important question, and it's interesting because it's, about three-quarters of the way through the semester with my ethics students, I tell them I have a personal goal for this course that's not one of the officially recognized learning
Hmm.
outcomes, as the buzzword is, which is
Hmm.
that you emerge from this class with a sense of yourself as a citizen, not necessarily of any particular nation, and I have students from all over the world, but a citizen of the world, that you feel a responsibility to the community of human beings of which you are a part. And that means you are more than a consumer, you are more than someone who receives, you are a doer and an actor in the world. And that you know, this is the nature of being a human being, and this is your responsibility. And I think that citizenship has been intentionally devalued
Hmm.
over my lifetime, and certainly in the period since September 11th. And a lot of it is this whole idea that only the experts can know about
Hmm.
something, and that we should
Hmm.
leave it to the experts to take care of little questions like how to respond to an attack on U.S. soil. And I think, as I said before, we've been encouraged to be afraid. We've been encouraged to let our fear be the leading factor in what we think our country ought to do. We've also been encouraged to believe, and this is one of the effects of living in a kind of highly developed capitalist economy, to believe that anybody's personal economic struggle is a result of personal individual failings and not the necessary outcome of the way
Hmm.
a particular economic system operates. And I see
Hmm.
this even in my brother, who probably believes a lot of the from the left conspiracy ideas that we've been sort of mentioning today. And nonetheless, when he is unemployed, he sees that as his own personal failure. And
Hmm.
and I think that this combination of individualism, which says I'm going to get mine, one day I'm going to win the lottery and be as rich as Donald Trump, and so therefore I want to protect rich people now because I'm going to be one of them one day, combined with this sense of personal shame when you're not one of them, has led to a society in which we really do not feel much responsibility for what our country does. And at the same time, people aren't stupid, right? You were saying before, look at the ways in which the electoral system, for example, is largely controlled or at least largely influenced by a plutocracy. People aren't dumb. They recognize that. And so they say, well, what can I do? And there's nothing I can do. And so then they settle in and settle for making a personal life that is not terrible, if they're able to do that, if they're white and if they have a certain amount of education and if they can get a job.
It's interesting that you bring that up, and I this is what makes this particular period in history so fascinating
Mm-hmm.
because it seems to me that in the most extraordinary way, on the left and the right in this country, outrage over the political system, campaign finance, and the economic system are so great
Mm-hmm.
that something might actually happen because it really does require that level of outrage
Mm-hmm.
across the political spectrum for anything to change
Right.
in this country.
Right.
And
Yeah.
yeah, sorry.
So I think you're right. And I think, one of the signs that is astonishing to me is how the movement for the $15 an hour minimum wage has taken off around the country. I mean, that was an idea that was considered,
Yeah.
higher than pie in the sky as little as 2 years ago. And now it's something that people like Hillary Clinton think they have to speak to on the campaign trail. And this is something that fascinates me. You never know when something that people have been banging their heads against and working on for years suddenly is going to break into mainstream awareness. And it's almost like you have to spend your life being ready like a surfer, sitting out there watching for the wave to come so that when it comes, you can actually ride that wave. And I think of that, a similar one is that we have suddenly woken up in this country to the fact that we have 2.2 million people locked up and have begun to recognize something that people have been screaming about for over a decade. Suddenly it's news that we have the largest incarcerated population.
It is extraordinary that this is a bipartisan issue right
Yeah,
now. I never thought I would live to see that happen.
yeah,
People for such a long time have kind of benefited from, being tough on
right,
crime
right.
and cracking down on criminals and this, that, and the other thing. And it is, as you just said, I never expected it to happen. So many things that are happening now, I would never expect it to happen just a short time ago. How could you imagine having a leading Republican candidate who is attacking the Bush administration for the war in Iraq,
I know.
and just talking about how corrupt the political system that has brought the last bunch of presidents to power is.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's so many things that are absolutely mind-boggling, including the issues that you're talking about, and justice, police, and
Yep.
actually I had a question about that. I'm going to ask you a question about that in a couple of minutes, but
Okay.
I'm keep to the script
All
here.
right.
So, I've noted since the Snowden revelation that there are okay. The way because we were just talking about this, and I guess what I want to ask you about is what chance do you think that this election will lead to changes that will head off the proverbial peasants with pitchforks burning down a system that a growing percentage of the population believes has denied them what they think is theirs, rightfully theirs? I mean, I actually thought I didn't know how this was going to play out, but it does feel like we are sort of on the edge of a civil explosion if things aren't handled just so. And that's kind of why Trump's comments about, beating up
Mm-hmm.
people in the crowd was, so disappointing and stupid,
Mm-hmm.
to me. What do you think about that?
Well, again, I think,
What is the chance? Are we
oh,
just this high in the sky,
I
or
think,
what?
I don't think that we're going to see in a positive way any kind of civil explosion. I think we may see,
No, I meant in a negative.
yeah,
I mean,
yeah,
I sense that when I say there's going to be a civil explosion if things aren't handled just right, that's what I
yeah,
mean.
no, I think that Trump has certainly done what he could to stir up those violent instincts, and it doesn't help that we live in a country where everyone who wants to can get hold of two or three guns. And, I don't know if you saw, but there was a petition going around a few weeks ago that was taken over by some progressive folks to say, yes, we absolutely should have open carry of weapons at the Republican National
Hmm.
Convention.
Yes, that was another delicious
Yeah,
story.
yeah.
I can't help but enjoy these stories
Well,
myself.
yeah, exactly. I mean, it is amusing. But yeah,
It's
I'll
so
I'll
ironic.
tell you, I think what we're going to see is more violence by white people against people of color, in really ugly ways. I was talking yesterday with some people who do a radio show, one's in New Jersey and one's in Florida, and they call themselves students for something, academic freedom or something like that. And what they are interested in is getting Marxism off college campuses. But one of the things that they talked about, which is clearly a common right wing belief, is that in the 8 years that Obama has been president, there's been a huge upsurge of black crime against white people,
Hmm.
and that white people are literally under daily violent attack from African Americans.
Hmm.
And this apparently is a widely held belief in a small subsection of people out there. And these are the people that Donald Trump is pandering to. And I think that there is a good chance that we will see not an overwhelming, not an overwhelming organized kind of revolutionary change, but I think we're going to see gangs of people attacking people of color.
Well, my thought was, if Donald Trump is denied the nomination despite having a
Right.
huge, plurality of
Right.
delegates, that could result in a very unpleasant
Oh, I
outcome.
think we'll
And
see
and
it.
then and you can look to 2020
Hmm.
as well. I mean, if this election doesn't resolve some of these
Oh
things,
yeah,
what the hell is going to be going on in 2020?
I know. And
It's
2020,
an alarming,
it's very alarming. 2020 is
possibility.
also really important for very boring, mundane reasons, which is that 2020 is a census year. And so what's going to be really important is who's in the state legislatures in 2020, because those are the people who are going to be doing the reapportioning and drawing the congressional districts, which is how the Republicans have stayed in power all these years, is by very, very accurate and clever gerrymandering. And so it's going to be really important that we not let all those state legislatures belong to the Republican Party, or we'll be looking at another 10, years of the same thing or worse.
Well, certainly interesting times in the
Yes, it
Chinese
is.
sense.
Yes, exactly.
So, uh, can you explain something else that was in your book that was sort of an anomaly, I thought, or not an anomaly, but something that I kind of looked at? U.S. Your book points out that U.S. federal law only defines torture as a crime when it is committed outside the United
Right.
States,
It's,
meaning that any such torture committed in Guantanamo, for example, cannot be prosecuted since it is under U.S. jurisdiction. So, in other words, it seems that U.S. officials under the federal code cannot be prosecuted for torturing people if it occurs in this country.
that's exactly right.
Can you explain that to
I
me?
can. And it actually goes back to the Clinton administration, and it has to do with the history of the ratification of the treaty. So the UN Convention Against Torture, which the US ratified in 1994, um, among the various things that it requires is it requires every nation that ratifies the treaty to also pass what's called implementing legislation, the legislation that
Mhm.
puts the treaty into effect in the national law of that country. So the argument went that we already in this country have the Fifth Amendment, the Eighth Amendment, that the amendments, the right to be prevented from cruel and unusual punishment, the right not to be forced to testify against oneself, and that we have many laws against assault and battery and kidnapping and all of those things, so that essentially the crimes that torture encompasses are already illegal under other federal law. So what remained was to make a law against people who might do these things in other places where those laws might not exist. Yeah,
Interesting.
it
So they just said, well, there's no need for such a law
exactly. We
because
don't.
we have laws that,
Yeah,
while they don't say the word torture, they still relate to the same activities.
exactly, exactly.
Hmm.
Yeah. Well,
A dubious
very
explanation.
dubious. And the UN Committee Against Torture, which every 5 years is supposed to receive a report from each of the signing nations, has repeatedly pointed out to the United States that this is not an adequate piece of implementing legislation and that they want federal legislation that outlaws torture straight up.
Mm-hmm.
And there's only one person who has ever actually been tried under the existing U.S. torture law, and this is a man who goes by several different names, but he's known as Charles Emanuel, and he is a son of the former dictator of Liberia, and he was charged, Charles Taylor, and he was charged and convicted of torture for activities that he had taken part in Libya, or in Liberia rather, but because he was a U.S. citizen, he was actually tried here in the United States for torture in Liberia.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, now that you brought that up, and this is probably something that you, my dear listener, may not have been aware of, uh, American troops have historically been prosecuted for torturing prisoners. In fact, U.S. military justice has prosecuted waterboarding as a form of torture since the Spanish-American War.
Mm-hmm.
So even before the Nuremberg trials of Nazi officials and the Geneva Accords on Human Rights,
Mm-hmm.
many of the actions authorized by the Bush administration and the Obama
Mm-hmm.
administration, to no small extent, since the beginning of the War on Terror, have long been regarded as serious crimes.
Yep.
So, how was the Bush administration able to justify such a departure from over a century of U.S. law and policy? I thought to myself.
You don't understand. We're living in a new paradigm. All of those quaint old laws no longer apply in a world that contains terrorism, which is this new phenomenon. I mean, it's absurd, but that was exactly what the Bush administration outlined just in the weeks after September 11th. We are in a new world with new rules, a new kind of war, something the world has never seen before. It's a new paradigm, which of course is nonsense.
Isn't it interesting how it was the year 2000 when you decided to go back to school? I mean, if you told anyone in the year 2000 what was about to
I know.
happen, they would think you were out of your mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it was just the right thing in terms of your career and your path. It's just very
It
interesting.
is. I mean, when I think about it, I am sort of astonished. But, I'm really glad that I've had an opportunity in this small little way to contribute to the work of opposing these kinds of things because I, to sort of finish where we started, I really do believe that impunity is dangerous for the world. That when the most powerful nation in the world can get away with crimes that are so great that people can't even call them crimes because it's unimaginable, then the world is in danger. And I agree with you that the people of the United States, have, as long as we live in at least a nominal democracy, we have a certain amount of responsibility to do something about it.
I absolutely agree. Well, all right, let me close this interview out with one more question. Um, you probably know President Obama is now on the ground in Saudi Arabia,
Yes.
and there is a bipartisan effort in Congress to pass legislation that would allow American citizens, particularly families of 9/11 victims, to sue state sponsors of terrorism. And the legislation is called JASTA,
Mm-hmm.
the Justice Against Sponsored Terrorism Act. The president opposes it because he says that if Americans are allowed to sue state sponsors of terror, it would open the floodgates to suits against Americans around the world.
Well, there you
It
go.
it occurred to me that if JASTA passes,
Mm-hmm.
it might be possible because of everything we've just discussed for the 9/11 families to sue U.S. officials for being state sponsors of terrorism as well. Could it be that this legislation might lead to the type of trial you describe in American Nuremberg?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Of course, these would be not criminal trials, but civil trials, right? Because we're
Hmm.
talking about suits. But nonetheless, they
Mm.
would be an official, organized way of holding people responsible. And it's a real possibility. One of the things that I ask in the book that the Obama administration should do is to stop standing in the way of individuals who are trying to sue for reparations or for some kind of being made whole for having been tortured by people working for the U.S. government. And the Obama administration has essentially done everything it could to prevent those suits from going forward, which, by the way, is another thing that the Convention Against Torture requires us to do, to allow those suits to happen. But
Hmm.
this is a very interesting idea, and I think there is something to it, that if people are allowed to sue, and that is probably one of the reasons, in addition to not wanting to offend allies, that the U.S. Is very uneasy about the idea of allowing that sort of suit. And I think, yes, it could be a very interesting venue.
It's bipartisan legislation.
Mm-hmm.
So, okay, Doc, I know you got to go, but I want to ask you one more
Sure.
thing because I have a lot of listeners who will want me to ask you this question. So, there are a lot of people out there that are suspicious of anything that hints at global governance
Mm-hmm.
or, in the language widely used in the alternative media, globalism pursued by globalists.
Mm-hmm.
So, is there anything you could say to ease the minds of those who fear a loss of U.S. sovereignty to global bodies, which, while couched in benign language of justice, fairness, and equality,
Mm-hmm.
conceal more sinister motives among our governing elite? If we were to, proceed and allow American officials to be prosecuted in some kind of a venue that was outside of the U.S., what would you say to these people?
Well, number one, I would say that the prosecution of those people runs counter to the actual interests of those very same global elites. So I
Hmm,
don't think that such a,
good point.
a venue would actually be doing their job for them, although they might be willing to cut a few people loose. So that's one thing. The other thing I would say is that we presently live in a world in which we can no longer afford the constant military competition, not to mention the economic competition among nations at a time when really the single biggest threat that is facing the world is an international threat, which is the threat of the change in the climate, which is going to hurt the poorest of us the first, and which absolutely requires not a response of the global elite, but a response of the global people. And I would also say that in addition to existing bodies like the United Nations, the World Court, the International Criminal Court, which, by the way, the US is not part of, that there are also international bodies of ordinary people that are really important sites of cooperation outside of the control of elites. And that part of what I think of myself as is an internationalist, meaning that I am as concerned with the rights and the well being of ordinary people in countries that are not the United States as in this country, and that I look to global organizations that bring ordinary people together as being very much a positive step towards, making it possible for this species to stick around for another few centuries.
Hmm. Sometimes I wonder if that would be such a good thing, but as a human being, I guess I have to root for us. Dr. Rebecca Gordon, author of the book American Nuremberg, which is now available at Amazon and all places books are sold. I want to thank you for being with us on the World Meets America report, and I hope you'll join us again
I'd
soon.
be delighted to. It was a great pleasure. Thank you so much.
It was an honor for me too. Have a wonderful
You
day.
too.
Taking us out, as always, is Dennis Ray and Moraine.